Hi, I'm John. I greeted as the autumn sun filtered through the towering oaks, casting dappled shadows across our sprawling family estate. The air buzzed with the lively chatter of relatives, and the warm breeze carried the mouth-watering aroma of roasting meat and freshly baked pie. It was the day of our annual family reunion. Beside me stood my wife, Anna, radiant and heavily pregnant, mingling gracefully with the crowd as we welcomed cousins, uncles, and aunts arriving in waves. Honey, isn't it wonderful to have everyone here? Anna squeezed my hand, her eyes scanning the crowd. It is, I replied with a smile, but stick close. You know how Mom can be. I whispered, nodding toward my mother, Helen, as she navigated through the crowd with sharp eyes, always assessing. As the day wore on, the initial small talk gave way to deeper conversations. My ever-cheerful sister-in-law, Julia, joined us by the edge of the garden, her presence offering a welcome buffer against Mom's increasingly watchful gaze. So John, that new case you're working on sounds intense, huh? Julia's attempt to steer the conversation elsewhere was transparent but appreciated. Yeah, it's complex, I replied with a laugh, but nothing compared to managing family dynamics. As my gaze drifted back to Mom, standing with a group of my aunts, her sharp eyes occasionally flickered in our direction. Anna noticed too, her expression tightening. I wish she'd just come out and say what's on her mind, Anna muttered. This silent judgment is exhausting. She thinks she knows what's best, I sighed, though the truth weighed heavy on me. The sun began to sink lower as everyone gathered around the long table set up on the lawn for dinner. The clinking of silverware mixed with the murmur of conversation, and glasses were raised in toasts. It was picturesque, almost perfect, until Mom sat directly across from us. John, I hope you've been making time for Anna, despite your busy schedule, Helen remarked, her voice carrying an edge that caused a few nearby relatives to pause mid-bite. Mom, Anna's doing great, I assured her, placing my hand over Anna's. Yes, Helen, I'm quite capable of taking care of myself. But thank you for your concern, Anna responded, her tone polite yet firm. Helen's lips tightened, her fork hovering in midair. Well, with the baby coming, you can't be too careful. I was just reading an article the other day about how important it is for expectant mothers to avoid stress. Really, Helen, I'm fine, Anna replied, her voice calm but resolute. John's been wonderful, and Julia has been such a great help. Julia, catching the cue, chimed in with a bright smile. Absolutely, and wait until you see the nursery we've been setting up. John, why don't you show your mom the photos? As dinner wore on, Helen's comments grew more pointed, veiled criticisms aimed at Anna's diet and her decision to continue working late into her pregnancy. The tension at the table thickened, with relatives exchanging uncomfortable glances. Finally, I stood, raising my glass. I'd like to propose a toast to family, both by blood and by bond. May we always support and uplift each other, no matter what. The glasses raised in agreement, and for a moment the air lightened. But Helen's tight smile as she sipped her wine hinted that the evening's peace was fleeting. As night descended and dessert was served, the warmth of the reunion cooled under a lingering shadow of unease. The earlier laughter and stories faded, replaced by tense shuffling as we moved inside for dessert. Anna, wait until you try the lemon tart. Julia's been raving about it all day, Aunt Margie said, her cheerful tone cutting through the stiffness. I'm sure it's wonderful, Anna replied, her arm linked with Julia's as they ascended the staircase together. But behind them, Helen's eyes narrowed, mistaking Julia for Anna due to their similar dresses. Her steps quickened, driven by a dangerous mix of resentment and misguided protectiveness. I need to speak with you, now Anna. Helen's voice, sharp with urgency, pierced the air, but it was Julia who turned. Helen, I think you. Julia began, but there was no time for explanations. In a swift, impulsive movement, Helen pushed her, sending Julia tumbling down the stairs. The sound of her fall was a terrifying symphony of gasps and a heavy thud. Julia. Anna screamed, rushing down the stairs as the family recoiled in shock. Helen stood frozen at the top, her face pale as the gravity of her mistake sank in. I pushed through the crowd, my legal instincts kicking in through the personal horror. Call an ambulance. Now, my voice cut through the chaos as I knelt beside Julia, assessing her injuries. Why would you do this, Helen? Anna's voice trembled with a mix of fury and fear. She's your niece. Helen's hands fluttered helplessly, her voice stammering. I thought she was you. I just wanted to talk. By pushing her down the stairs. My voice was cold, my eyes searching hers for some explanation that made sense. As Julia was rushed away on a stretcher, moments later, the house fell into a somber silence. John took Helen aside, his voice tight with a mix of disbelief and authority. What's going on, Mom? Your behavior tonight wasn't just out of line. It was dangerous. What did you think Anna was going to do? Helen wrung her hands, her voice a shaky whisper. It's all those articles and talk shows. They say some women trick men, trap them with pregnancies. I thought she was manipulating you. John blinked in disbelief. Manipulating? Anna, she's my wife, Mom, and we're having this baby together. How could you believe something like that about her? I got scared, Helen muttered, her eyes downcast. Seeing her, or who I thought was her, it all just came rushing back. John ran a hand through his hair, struggling to reconcile the protective mother he had known with the woman who now stood before him, consumed by irrational fears. Anna needs me. Julia needs justice. We're going to deal with this, but right now, I can't even look at you. He turned away from his mother and walked back to Anna, who stood by the door with red, swollen eyes. As they awaited word on Julia's condition, John's resolve hardened. The night air, thick with unspoken words, mirrored the family's shattered trust. The festive atmosphere of the reunion had dissolved, replaced by the grim reality of the consequences of a misunderstanding that nearly cost a life. At the hospital, the sterile hum of fluorescent lights echoed in the narrow corridor as John paced outside Julia's room. Inside, Anna sat by her sister's bedside, holding her hand as the quiet beeping of medical monitors filled the room. The weight of the night's events pressed heavily on John's mind as he considered the next steps. Returning from the security office, John held a USB drive in his hand, the small device loaded with undeniable evidence. I've got the CCTV footage from the house, he said, his voice low but steady. It's clear. Helen saw Julia, mistook her for you, and pushed her, no hesitation. Anna's voice trembled. Why would she do this, John? It doesn't make any sense. It was deliberate, Anna, he replied. She really thought she was pushing you. It's twisted, but it's right there, in black and white. Just then, Dr. Simmons entered the room, his expression serious. Julia is stable, but she has a concussion and a broken leg. She's going to have a long recovery. John nodded, his voice calm but firm. Thank you, doctor. Can we have a moment? The doctor exited the room quietly, leaving them alone. John turned to Anna. There's something you need to see. It's not easy, but I think you should know how far this went. Together, they watched the footage on John's laptop, the grainy black and white images revealing the horrifying truth of Julia's fall. Anna gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. Oh God, John, she really thought she was pushing me. John took her hand, his voice steady but filled with conviction. I've been thinking, we can't let this go. Julia deserves justice, and we need to protect you and our baby. Anna looked up at him, her voice shaking. What are you saying? I'm saying that my mother needs to face the consequences. I'm going to press charges. But she's your mother, John. Can we really go through with this? John's gaze was firm. If we don't, then what? She nearly killed Julia. What if next time it's you, or our child? Anna nodded slowly, her own resolve strengthening. You're right, it's just hard. I know, John said softly, squeezing her hand. But it's necessary, for all of us. Leaving the room, John made some calls, reaching out to the family attorney and laying out the situation. His voice was resolute. Yes, I understand the ramifications, but I can't let this slide. She has to be held accountable. Back in the hospital room, Anna's phone buzzed with a text from her brother-in-law, Michael, who had just heard about the incident. Is it true what happened? Is Julia okay? Anna quickly replied, explaining the situation and John's decision. Michael's response was immediate. You have our full support. This is unimaginable, but it's necessary. John returned to the room, placing a reassuring hand on Anna's shoulder. The lawyer is on board, he said quietly, his voice firm but comforting. In the days that followed, preparations began to move forward with legal proceedings. We'll start as soon as Julia is able to give her statement, John said to Anna. The next few days blurred with legal discussions and tense family meetings. Relatives divided, some in disbelief at Helen's actions, while others condemned her outright. John found himself distanced from many people he had once been close to, the rifts caused by his stance seeming too deep to ever fully heal. One evening, as John and Anna sat quietly in the hospital cafeteria, Anna reached for his hand. "No matter what happens, we're in this together, right?" "Right. Together," John replied, his voice steady, his grip firm. As they returned to Julia's room, John glanced between his wife and his sister-in-law. He steeled himself for the fight ahead. The truth was unraveling, exposing the cracks in a family that had once seemed unbreakable. The courtroom was tense, the only sounds being the shuffle of papers and the occasional murmur. Helen sat stiffly beside her lawyer, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Across the room, John stood with Anna, bracing himself to watch his mother face justice. The judge entered the room, and a reverent hush fell over the crowd. "This court is now in session," his voice boomed, echoing through the chambers. The prosecutor stood, her voice clear and resolute. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here to address a grave act of violence, one that could have ended in tragedy. We will show that Helen acted not out of confusion, but out of malice, endangering the life of her niece, Julia, whom she believed to be her daughter-in-law, Anna." Helen's lawyer rose in response, his tone calm and measured. "We acknowledge the severity of the situation. However, we argue that this was a misunderstanding fueled by concern, not an intent to harm." As the trial unfolded, witnesses recounted the events of that fateful night. Anna took the stand, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I never imagined we would end up here, facing such a heartbreaking family rift. Julia was mistaken for me, and it wasn't an accident. It was intentional." Then came the pivotal moment, the presentation of the CCTV footage. The prosecutor played the video, the images stark and undeniable. The footage showed Helen pushing Julia, and a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. John watched the screen, torn between his roles as son and attorney, each frame of the video feeling like a personal blow. When John was called to testify, he spoke of his mother's growing resentment and paranoia. "It pains me deeply, but I must stand for what is just. My mother's actions were deliberate and dangerous." In her defense, Helen finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I thought I was protecting my son. I believed there was a threat to his future, to our family's honor. I'm sorry, truly sorry, but it was a mistake." The jury didn't deliberate long. The evidence was overwhelming. Soon, the judge was reading the verdict. Based on the evidence presented, the jury finds the defendant, Helen, guilty of aggravated assault. The judge announced Helen's sentence: years of probation and a restraining order to protect Anna and her unborn child. The finality of the judgment echoed through the courtroom, settling like a weight on everyone present. After the trial, as the crowds dispersed, John and Anna stood together outside, the tension of the past weeks lifting slightly. Anna looked up at John, her eyes a mix of sorrow and relief. "It's over, but how do we move on from this?" John took her hand, his voice resolute. "We rebuild. Together. We focus on our future, on our family. We make sure our child grows up in love, not resentment." Their commitment to each other and their future child was unshaken, even as they navigated the aftermath of a family fractured by fear and misunderstanding. And that concludes their story. It's been a long, difficult journey, but it leaves us with a question. If you were in John's position, would you press charges against a family member to uphold justice, or would you find another way to resolve the situation in order to preserve family bonds? It's a tough call, one that balances moral duty and family loyalty. What would you do? Please share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.